afternoon, everybody. It looks like we're getting settled in with our lunches, and so we'll go ahead and get our program started. I'll do a few admin thingies first, just to get them out of the way. Thanks again, as always, for joining us on this third Thursday of the month. It's really great to see the way our Lunch and Learn programs are growing, thanks to the work of staff here, both the library staff and, of course, the foundation staff. And your lunch today is courtesy of the Eisenhower Foundation. And you can become a friend of the foundation if you'd like to help support them in this work, and we can get information to you following the program. We also have a bit of government paperwork they encourage us to submit in terms of surveys asking about the program. We'll hand those out while Mark is speaking. It's certainly not mandatory, but we do appreciate any comments you can give us. Any feedback, any suggestions for programs you'd like to see in the future. We're open to just about anything. Well, our speaker today is Mark Eberle. Mark teaches in the Department of Biological Sciences out of Fort Hays State. He's written books on Kansas fish, and fish in the central part of the country when he's not writing about baseball. He's the author of a big book, A Big History of Kansas Baseball, which covers the sport from 1858 to 1941, and we do have those for sale in the gift shop, and I'm sure Mark would be happy to autograph it for you, just like a baseball. So, his subject today is one of those issues about Eisenhower that's been a matter of some controversy, I think until now, because Mark's done such a thorough job of research, and that's the question of, did Ike play baseball under the assumed name of Wilson? And as you'll hear, he was pretty coy about it, and for years he was confused with this player named Wilson because Ike hinted that he'd used that name, and I think Mark has really unraveled it, and so I'm excited to hear his presentation today. So please welcome Mark Eberle.
Make sure I do this. I'm not used to speaking in a microphone in class. I just yell at my students. So I'll try to stay close by here. Thank you all for coming out, and thank you to the Eisenhower Library and the Foundation for inviting me to come out and speak. I am playing hooky today, so everybody. I have someone else covering my classes for me today. It's kind of just orientation day for most of them, so it's not too big a deal. And so with this presentation, of course, it's mostly going to focus on this controversy. You can see that I have quotes around the word controversy, so you might be able to kind of get an idea of where I'm going to go when I get to the end of this presentation. But hopefully I'll be able to get through this in reasonably good order, but I'll give you time to ask questions. And so hopefully we can get through all that. And so part of this, just as a caveat before I get started, as his secretary noted, I told her not to answer questions about professional baseball anymore because it's too complicated. And so it is, and I have a written version of this that's available online, and so that's the web address. It's going to be up there again at the end of the program, or I can help you see it afterwards if you wish. So it's a PDF file from our university's library, so you can blow it up to whatever size font you want and those kind of things to read it. So it'll have a lot more detail than I'm going to be able to cover today. And before I get started, I just want to thank a couple of people so I don't forget at the end when I get all wrapped up in this topic. Tim, of course, has helped me with this. He's a baseball person, of course, and so he's pointed me in the right direction on a couple of items that I wasn't aware of, and so he's helped with that. And I also want to acknowledge just the work of the library, the staff, and the facilities here that do such a good job of making all this information available for all future generations of researchers like me and others that will come later, so we can learn more and more about these people that are an important part of our past. Bill Swank, who's spoken here some years ago, about this topic. He started diving into it, and he pointed me at some things that I was able to follow up on and get a little more information about, so I'm kind of building on what he had done. Jan Johnson, who showed up today, I'm a biologist, not a historian, and so she's kind of pointed me in the right direction on how to find out some of this information. It's a different world of research in some ways. And the last person up there, I just want to make sure his name's on there because he's the one that's covering for me today while I'm speaking. So going to start with just a little bit of background information, and then we'll get into the controversy as it is. Baseball around Abilene has had a variety of forms, and so 3 of the terms, this is going to kind of be important to this discussion, are professional, semi-professional, and amateur. Amateur is kind of straightforward. These are people that play and they don't get any money, right? They just play for the love of the game kind of a thing. Professional is mostly pretty well clearly used in the literature, but not always. For Abilene and the stuff that I'm going to talk about today, it would be independent or minor league teams. These are people that was their primary source of income during the season. They might have had another job in the winter, but that was what they were doing for money all season long when they were able to play from spring till fall. Semi-professional is a word that gets thrown around in a lot of different contexts, so it can be a little bit confusing. And what I'm going to refer to as semi-professional this time is a team that has maybe 1 or 2 players that are being paid, maybe some are still amateur, or the whole team may get to benefit if they go to a tournament and there's prize money or something of that nature, they all get a cut of the prize kind of thing. But they have other jobs. So they're not just doing baseball, but they do get a little bit of money to help at least cover expenses and those sorts of things as they play the game. So that term is a little bit crazy in places, but we'll keep it nice and focused today. And before I really get too much in there, because I've done some other research on baseball history, and so that's not an Abilene team, that's the original Kansas City Monarchs of 1908. And so the reason I put that up there is because the second person in line, the first one wearing a uniform, is a man named Burt Wakefield from Troy, Kansas. And he was the second baseman for Abilene's team in 1897 and 1898. They weren't part of a minor league, but they were all professionals. And so virtually none of the players were from Abilene. I think they had 1 or 2, depending on which year it was. And so he was on the team. They also had an American Indian pitcher named Isaac Augusta, who played for a variety of minor league and other professional teams around that time. So a lot of the players, American Indian players that were in this region all came out of Haskell. They weren't necessarily native to Kansas, but they were all there going to school, and the school had its own baseball team that traveled around. So some of those guys were good enough they could go off and play on a variety of teams and make some extra money in the summers. Burt Wakefield, the reason I followed up on him is because most people think of Jackie Robinson as integrating professional baseball. It's more accurate to say he reintegrated professional baseball. Burt Wakefield is one of three Kansans, African Americans, who played on minor league teams in the 1890s. And it was then that color line got drawn, and then Jackie Robinson reintegrated it after the Second World War. So he also was noteworthy because he had a rare distinction of being the captain of an otherwise white team, which just wasn't done in the 1890s. So kind of a unique story for Kansas. For our purposes though, focusing in on Abilene, they did have a minor league team. So these are kind of the years we're going to be looking at here with this controversy. And Abilene did have a minor league team for 2 seasons. In what was known as the Central Kansas League, mostly teams kind of in north central Kansas, where they overlapped. The Kansas State League was mostly south central Kansas. So they got down to Ark City and Winfield and some places like that. And so there were kind of 2, there were other minor leagues in the state at that time. There was kind of a boom in minor leagues during this era. And so Abilene did have 2 teams. They did have to change the name the second year because they got new uniforms and they came with blue socks instead of red socks. So they had to change the name, get rid of the socks on there to make it accurate. But there were minor league teams running around all the way up through 1914. Then a lot of them started to disappear, but World War I was on the horizon, it was starting, and so that kind of diminished the number of teams that were playing, not just in Kansas, but other places as well. And then this is the timeline that's going to be important to us. He graduated in May 1909. He did go back to school briefly to get ready for his exams to try and get into the academies. But he did finally go. He actually knew beforehand, but he actually left and went to the academy at West Point in 1911 in June. He got to come back twice. So after 2 years, they gave him a few weeks off in the summer, so he came back to Abilene. And then he got a summer off before they actually posted him, his first posting being down in Texas, but he got a summer off to visit family and friends before they sent him off to wherever, in this case down to the south. And then we also know a fair amount about what Ike was doing for a job during this period. So he graduated in May of 1909, and there are records that indicate he was working throughout this period. Most of that was at the creamery. But he did work for a little while at what was called the tank factory. It had nothing to do with military stuff. The tanks were water stock tanks for water, for cattle, and those kinds of things. And they also built bigger ones out of that corrugated metal for storing grain. So those were the tanks. They were to hold things. And so we know he was working both of those summers, after he graduated and before then he went to West Point in June. And we do know something about his baseball, things where he was actually mentioned specifically. So we do know a few things about what he did. Of course, he played for the high school team for those 2 years, 1908 and 1909. That's the 1908 picture there. There's another one in the newspaper. I haven't found an original yet, so it's real grainy, of the other team. And so it's not as good for putting up here. But after he graduated, he served as the scorekeeper for the high school team. That following spring, so he was still around trying to figure out what he was going to do when he went to college. And then he served as the umpire for the high school team spring, right before he headed out in June to head off to West Point. So he was actually the umpire at that point. He did play on some community teams. A lot of times the newspapers would only tell you the pitcher and the catcher's names. They wouldn't tell you the whole team for these things. And so he was mostly playing center field. And so his name didn't show up as much as some of the people that were pitching and catching. But we do know he played for the Knights of Honors, kind of a fraternal organization for boys, older boys, young men. There was a team organized by the Tank Factory in 1910 that he played for. And then there's another one, I'm not sure if he played in that game in Solomon, but there was a mixed team of some of the players trying out for the minor league club and some town folks that went over to Solomon and played a game too. So they only mentioned the pitcher and catcher. They didn't mention any of the other fielders. So he might or might not have been on that team. But we do know that he participated in 2 games that were benefits for the minor league team. Right? These baseball associations were always looking for ways to raise money. The first of those games was against the Cherokee Indians barnstorming team. And they played a night game. They brought their own lights, not the best lights, but they brought their own lights. And it was the first night game in Abilene. They were traveling around doing this in lots of towns, so it was kind of the first night game for a lot of places. And Dwight played center field for the Abilene team. They lost by a couple of runs, but they didn't do too badly against this team that was already used to playing with these night lights kind of thing. It's very different to play night baseball, especially with poor lighting. And then he played in another game after the minor league season had ended. They had a fundraiser game where some of the town folk, Eisenhower playing center field again, played against the minor league club, just as a way to generate some money to help them make all their expenses that they had to pay out, not just salaries, but travel costs and those things. So they had a game that he played center field in against the minor league players at that time. Oh, then he had a couple of minor experiences because he had those 2 furloughs. Mostly he was an umpire for a Sunday school league in 1913, so each of the churches had its own team, and then the 2 black churches kind of pooled their resources and came up with one team. So it was an integrated league, segregated teams, but an integrated league, and he was the umpire, one of the umpires for that season. And then once they got to the end of the season, what happened is a lot of the best of the white players decided they were going to organize one town team and go out and challenge Chapman and Solomon and some of those towns. And so he ended up, before he had to go back, he had one more chance to kind of get out on the field. He played center field, and the team they practiced against before they went out was the black team, not against the other white players, but against the black team. So he was umpiring games that involved black players. He was also playing against black players, not something that's usually done at this time. And when he came back in 1915, he had that summer off. He spent a lot of time traveling to visit folks in other cities, his brothers and such. But he did spend some time umpiring for the town team. And that picture is in other places around here at the beginning where he was sitting in that car is probably a picture of him being driven to Chapman for Labor Day to umpire a game over there. Usually the hometown provided the umpire. But if you've got somebody who's just graduated from West Point, you kind of think maybe you could trust him. And so they asked him to come over, and they sent a car to pick him up and drive him over. So they sent one of the baseball players in their Model A over to pick him up and drive him over to Chapman to umpire that game. And then after that, he was off to Texas. So he was doing some things that are interesting, that have nothing to do with the controversies that have come up subsequently, but to play in a night baseball game in 1910, to umpire and play against black teams in 1913. These were kind of unusual sorts of things. So he did have some interesting experiences as a baseball player. Most of those have kind of been forgotten. It's all kind of come down to this controversy. And part of that controversy involved a person named Wilson. And there was a person named Wilson. There are actually several people named Wilson. I tracked down several of them. And so this is, and the Sporting News, kind of a big deal newspaper at the time, even right away in 1945, started saying that Eisenhower and this Affie Wilson were the same people playing for the Junction City Soldiers. It's not true. That one I can say with absolute certainty was not true. Because the Junction City Soldiers, when Wilson played for them, it was in July of 1911 and Eisenhower was already in New York. So that was not true. But that story's still out there because once things get printed or they get posted, they never really go away. And somebody that's just kind of doing kind of superficial research sees that and goes, oh, they found him. And no, they didn't. But those stories are always out there, and if you don't really dig into them, you kind of come up with the wrong conclusions. But this Affie Wilson was actually a pretty prominent player. He was the manager of the Abilene team. Once that shut down, he moved to Great Bend. They hired him to be their manager. And he actually took them to the championship of the league 3 consecutive years. He was well known in the region. Everybody loved him. It was said in the newspaper that Affie, people would ask, what Affie, where did that come from? That it was short for affable. And when he played in Arizona, his nickname was actually not Affie, it was Teddy Bear Wilson. So everybody loved him. He was just so easy to get along with, but he expected a lot from his players. They were out practicing when other minor league teams weren't out practicing and things like that. But they all played and they were very professional. They'd be referred to as the gentlemen of the league because they weren't always getting in fights and things of that nature. So everybody in the league knew Affie Wilson and really respected him because he helped develop a lot of young players that moved on up through the minor leagues and occasionally to the major leagues. So he was a well-known person. And so that's going to kind of play a role in this controversy assessment as well. Okay, so the controversy. Just to make sure everybody's kind of up to speed, this is still out there, it still gets printed all the time. I've gotten one phone call from the Washington Post asking about the controversy. It's just still, everybody wants the controversy. I guess that's what we love nowadays. But, so these are all fairly recent sort of things from some prominent sort of online sources. So Major League Baseball and stuff are still posting blogs about this controversy. And what it is, there's really kind of 2 parts to this story. And the first part is, did he play professional baseball? Which would be kind of a neat story. Not many of our presidents played professional baseball or any other professional sport. And so it would be a neat story in that sense. The controversy comes connecting that professional experience to West Point. And so that's where the actual controversy is. So those headlines are a little bit misleading as they go through this. And so what I tried to do was take what some other people have done and try and go even further and figure out how this story all plays out. And so I can't put everything up here, but there's not a whole lot. I've only left out a couple of things. This was the first. This is what started the whole controversy. Because, right, so June, we're talking about a month after VE Day. One of the things he did when he came back stateside is he said, I'm going to a baseball game. I mean, you know, imagine all the stress that he'd been going through the previous 4 years, just unimaginable stress. And he just wanted to go to a baseball game and relax, and I think probably, you know, just go back to your boyhood kind of an approach, just to kind of decompress a little bit. And so he went to that game, and these are actual quotes out of the newspaper, so what's in quotation marks is what they gave credit to Ike for actually saying. The rest of it is the reporter just paraphrasing. And so they had said, did you actually play semi-pro baseball when you were young? And so he said, and although I think it's probably an error, that as a student in college, that he did, under the name Wilson in the Kansas State League. And so right away, the Sporting News and some of those places, that's where they picked this up and went, oh, we found Wilson, it was in July of 1911. so they didn't really look into it at that time either. And so that was kind of what started this. And then a couple of days later, he visited his family in Abilene. And so the reporters, after that first one, they kept asking him and asking. It became like this big story from the beginning. And so they continued to ask about it. And so he finally said, yes, I was a center fielder, which is true. Almost all the time he played, he was a center fielder. And he said that he didn't want to do it to be a baseball player, although later he did say he wished he could have been like Honus Wagner. But he did it to make money to go to college. He and his brother Edgar were going to have this plan worked out where they were going to earn money and help each other go to college. And so this was a way for him to make money. How do you make the most money possible in the summer in this time, in this day and age? And so he also noted that he wasn't a very good center fielder, so he didn't do very well at it. And so that may give us some indication of how this is going to go too. There were some indications that he did this before all this stuff hit the newspaper in 1945 through the Times and other newspapers. Tim pointed this one out to me from his diary in 1930. He was traveling through Hutchinson and wrote in his diary that he played there 21 years ago, 1909. So that kind of fits that time frame. And that's it. There's no other information associated with that diary entry. I've looked and looked and looked through all the baseball records for 1909, and there's no Eisenhower there. In fact, there's not even Wilson's there. But so what happened exactly, I'm not sure. And then he mentioned, so this is a diary that was published in 1946, but his naval aide was keeping a diary of his time with Eisenhower, and then, of course, after the war, everything had gone well, so he published his diary, and he said that apparently waiting for Churchill was kind of a routine thing. If you were going to have a meeting with Churchill, expect to wait. And so the two of them were talking in Algiers. This is before D-Day and all that would have happened. This is 1943. And so they were just chatting, and he mentioned, and he wrote in his diary that Ike had mentioned that he played semi-pro baseball and worked at the creamery and stuff, so all those things. So he wasn't just saying it in the newspaper in 1945. He was writing and talking about this beforehand, but it was just to himself in his diary or to individuals, just one-on-one kind of conversations, not to brag, just to be having a conversation. And then it just kind of kept going and going and going. Tim would probably say it's still going and going and going, but people just never let up. They kept asking. Newspapers, magazines, people were always just asking about this baseball story. Tell us more, because that's pretty much all he said. And so they wanted to know more and more about that. And so in 1960, I found there were a couple of letters in the archives here that were identical. It's kind of a cut and paste sort of thing, but using a typewriter, so a little more laborious. That, you know, he did not play in the major or minor leagues. But he did play for the high school, so she doesn't mention anything else, just those two. But no, he did not play in the major or minor leagues during those years. And then the following year, it just got to the point where I just said, enough. We're just not talking about this anymore. And so this was a note from his aide to the rest of the staff saying, just stop talking about the professional baseball question. It's just so distracting and annoying. Just don't talk about it. It gets really complicated if we want to try and explain it all anyway. And that phrase about being complicated comes from this note that was attached to it. So this is from his secretary, that he did play professional baseball. He made one trip, maybe the Hutchinson trip, who knows? But he made one trip. He didn't mention a name again like he did at the beginning in 1945. But he says, just stop. It's just too complicated to keep going on with this. And so there's not a lot of information to go on to try and figure out exactly what happened when he was talking about those summers of 1909 and 1910. And so this is small print, I realize. What I want you to see is just the big image here. So this is where the biology scientist part of me kind of kicked in a little bit. This is what we call a decision tree. So we don't have a lot of information, but we want to know, well, how are we going to approach this? What kinds of questions can we ask? And so on the far left, it just starts with a real simple statement. Eisenhower played professional baseball. Okay, let's assume that's true. Then we have two branches that come off of that. One says he played in the minor leagues, and one says he played semi-pro town team ball. Both possibilities that we might want to look at. Then if we follow the minor league track, did he play during the regular season or did he play in exhibition games, preseason, postseason kind of games? And just follows along that line. until we come up with all what we think are all the different possible scenarios, and then we know what we want to try and go and assess. So that's where I came up with 6 hypotheses. And so this is it, and I only accepted 2 of those as being realistic. I have no smoking gun. I did not find Eisenhower's name in a box score playing for some minor league or professional team. No one, probably no one ever will, but no one has found one yet. I don't think it probably exists. So this is just the best I can do with the information that was out there. The first 2 are kind of similar because one says he played under the name Wilson, and then one says, well, what if he maybe used a different name? Maybe Wilson was the first name that came to his head or something. Let's just consider that possibility. And I ended up rejecting both of those hypotheses as not being very likely, in part because of his work schedule. If you're going to be on a minor league team, you're going to be gone days because you're going to travel and you're going to go to Concordia and be up there and play 3 days against that team, and then maybe you go to Junction City or whatever. How are you going to hold down a full-time job in 1909 and 1910 and be traveling where you might be gone at least half a week, perhaps the entire week? It just doesn't match up that was likely. I also went through, because Wilson was the name mentioned, and I went through and found all the Wilsons that I could. And there were like half a dozen, but most of them weren't ones you really have to consider because they were playing in 1912 or something like that when we know he was gone. And there were 2 possibilities then. Affy Wilson, but we know who Affy Wilson was, so we know he wasn't the same person. There was another one he played for Manhattan on their team. He lived in St. George, so he was commuting every day. Everybody knew him as well. They were both well-known players in the area. So they're not Eisenhower playing under a fake name kind of a thing. And some of the others just weren't around the right years. They were here when Ike was gone. So the third one is a possibility, because he did say he wasn't very good at it. And so maybe he tried out for a minor league team. I can't say that he didn't. A lot of these tryouts, when we think of tryouts now, we think of people like spring training. It goes on for weeks and months. Tryouts back then might have been 1 or 2 days. Some of those players were around such a short time, they never even got their names for the newspaper. And so Abilene that very first year had 8 center fielders. And I don't know the names of most of them because they never got put in the paper because they were here so short a time. So maybe he tried out and he wasn't very good at it. And you're not going to admit that you got dumped right away during spring training if you're talking to the professional players at a baseball game in June of 1945. So maybe that's why he just kind of stopped talking a little bit at that point. So it's possible he tried out for the minor league team and just didn't get very far. Then I kind of rejected the 4th one there, that he would have actually been just playing somebody else, actually signed the contract and he went and substituted for him. I think that's highly unlikely because these teams were financially very fragile. And it happened to the team in Concordia. They substituted a player and they had to forfeit a game in the playoffs. I mean, they managed to come back and win, but they had to forfeit a game in the playoffs. So you would have been taking a really big chance to put in kind of an okay center fielder on a team that could draw players from all around the country. And so I think it's not likely that he was playing under a fake name, that somebody else had actually signed the contract instead of him. Then postseason exhibition games, a lot of these clubs did do postseason exhibition games because once the season was over, they had to go get another job somewhere. And so they would try and extend the season as long as possible. And there weren't very many of those that involved the teams like Abilene, Great Bend, those kind of places where Affy Wilson and some of the others were playing. But they did take such an exhibition tour in 1913 when he was back on his furlough. While he was here, basically this Affy's gone to Great Bend now because the Abilene team is shut down. But they would have known each other, right? They played in games together and they cooperated on high school teams because some of the minor league players would be umpires and such at the games that Eisenhower was working in things too. And so what probably happened in that case was it wasn't Eisenhower. And it wouldn't matter to the controversy if it was. Wilson, they did play 3 games in Hutchinson, which makes it kind of intriguing. But it was 1913, not 1909. So he would have been way off in his years. But the other thing is, Wilson only played in 1 game. And so if he did, it was for 1 game. So maybe that was it, and maybe he did get his years wrong, but I kind of doubt it. Wilson played first base, And so Eisenhower was an outfielder. And then the last one that I think is most likely is that he played for a semi-pro town team. Not necessarily Abilene, because they had a minor league team for those 2 years, but Chapman had one, Solomon had one. Towns that don't even exist had these these kind of town teams. And so I did find one, Wilson, that played for Niles during one of the summers, and that's all I know. There was one game, there was a center fielder named Wilson. I have no other information on that person. There was nothing else printed. But that's the sort of thing that would be, you could mix that with his employment. Because most of these guys, that wasn't, if you're on a semi-pro town team, that's your second job, not your day job. And so they wouldn't have been traveling where they were gone for 3 or 4 nights. They would have been going out, playing after work, and coming back home, even if they went, across the county or something of that nature. And maybe they played for a portion of the gate receipts. A common thing back then was like a 60-40 split on gate receipts. The winner got 60% of the income and the loser got 40%. So maybe he was making some money, not a lot, but some money that supplemented his income from the creamery or the tank factory. So I think that's probably the most likely case of what happened. Okay, this part now, this is the controversy. Right? Playing ball, there's nothing controversial about that. But the controversy comes in that people assume that he broke NCAA rules and he was a liar to get into the academy. And so just kind of a little bit of background information here. We know he played football for Army in 1912. He also got hurt toward the end of that season and almost ended his military career as well. Army was a member of the NCAA, so everybody has assumed, well, you can't do that. And so he must have lied to do it. The problem is most people didn't do a very good job of looking into the early history of the NCAA. So the NCAA is actually a very new organization. It wasn't even called that until 1910, and it was founded late in the year in 1905. In large part, Teddy Roosevelt had a hand in kind of pushing these clubs to do this. A lot of the problems there were 2 problems. One is football isn't like today's. Football is more like rugby, and people were dying. And so they went, this can't continue. I mean, now we hear stuff about concussions. People are actually dying playing rugby-style football. And there were also teams, Ivy League schools, even those Ivy League schools were cheating, where they would go out and find a professional that did that sport and say, we'll make you a student this year so you can help us beat so-and-so. And so that was a problem. People were bringing in ringers who really were professional athletes, not just playing for fun when they were growing up, but they were professional athletes. So there was some of that going on. So that's why the NCAA first got started under that other name that's much longer, but it switched over to NCAA. Then the other thing that's going to be important in this is the first president of the NCAA was part of the academy at West Point. And so his statements, because he's president of the NCAA, his statements are going to show up more frequently than those of other people, and that's going to help a little bit with this. So not to read all of that, but basically this is the rule we kind of expect when we think about the NCAA today. And essentially when you boil that down, what it says is you cannot have made any money, period, in any kind of sporting activity. You can't even have been a gym teacher and be eligible to play on a college team. So all of that would have precluded you from doing that, let alone making money as a professional athlete, or making, even if you just went to one tournament and got a cut, $5 or whatever for your share of the tournament pool, all of those things would have prohibited you from playing. And so everybody has assumed, because that's kind of what we think of today for the NCAA. It's really black and white. You don't get to make money doing sports. But in the early days, the rule kind of continued into this part here. And I don't know if everybody just quit reading after that first part or what they did. But basically what this says is we're distinguishing between professional athletes, the ringers, and the people that just play summer baseball for fun, just to make some extra cash. That's not the same thing, and we don't care if they do that. And so there was an out for this summer baseball sort of a thing. And so it seems really black and white until you read this last caveat and how it's to be enforced. And what they're talking about is each individual school enforcing this, not the NCAA, but the individual schools. And so what we see then is that they did a poll just to ask their members. So you can see there's not a lot of members at this time. It's not nearly as big as it is now. And not every team, one team, I didn't put their number up there because they just said, we're so tired of trying to figure this out, we're just not going to have baseball, period. So that's how we're going to deal with it. But the ones that did have a baseball program, over half of them said, we don't care if they play summer baseball, as long as they're not a ringer, as long as they're not a pro that you're trying to sneak in. If it was just some kid playing for fun, and he got a little money out of it, we don't care. Most schools thought that. And they had like formal debates, I'll go into more detail in this, but they had formal debates about the pros and cons of this whole summer baseball thing. But the other part that I think makes a difference here too is, right, there's Captain Pierce. So the president, also a member of the US Army, that's what his captaincy is. And so this is 6 months before Ike showed up. And he says, I mean, because they're talking about summer baseball. Football, basketball, none of those things mattered. It was just the summer baseball was the only real thing that caused these problems. That this association, the NCAA, does not frown upon the playing of summer baseball. But if you lie about it, we do care. And so if you put yourself in Ike's place, and you're going to West Point 6 months, and this is the attitude of West Point among those teams, and they say, we don't care if you played summer baseball just to make some extra cash, but you better not lie to us. Everybody has kind of assumed Ike lied. But the incentive would have actually been, don't lie, because they don't care. But they will care if you lie. So I'm not sure what the incentive is. It seems to me that you have to have kind of a dark view of society if you assume that Ike went completely against what the logical course would have been if he knew those facts. And so, in that sense, the controversy, I think, doesn't stand up. Unless somebody comes up with an absolute smoking gun that Eisenhower lied on some form, which I don't think still exists if there ever was one, there's no logical reason to assume that he lied to play football. There were other players doing the same thing. Jim Thorpe lost all of his medals in 1912. That was the AAU that made those go away. But then he went back and played against Eisenhower in football after that summer. So Carlisle was another one of those NCAA schools. So the rules weren't the black and white rules we have now. And so if you look at all the information from that period and how things were actually viewed specifically at the academy, I don't see the incentive for Ike to have lied. It wouldn't have gotten him in trouble to have played the game. Okay, so that's the really short, bridge version. There's a lot more information in that article, so that's kind of what it looks like. But that's the webpage where it is. It's a free download. And so you can get that and look at it to your heart's content. There's also some other stuff on there too. The one about Burke Wakefield playing here and some of those other things are also, there's some other publications on baseball. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have, because I know I left some things out to try and get this done. But what we'd like for you to do is wait for Tim to bring a microphone so everything gets recorded. That saves me some work if you do.
Did I play high school football in Eberle?
Yeah, he did. And he kind of, that's the rules were so weird back then too, because he went back for another fall to take some extra classes to get ready for the academy tests. He was looking at Navy and Army, but to get ready for the exams, and he got to play football again, and he'd already graduated. So the rules were really, really flexible back then compared to what they are today. Guys are letting me off easy. Wait.
Did you say, and I missed it, what the name of the Eberle semi-pro team was?
Most of the time they just called them the town team or something along those lines. Like Hayes, I know Hayes had a big deal. They've had a town team since the turn of the century also. They didn't actually get a name until 1946.
But Eberle had a team during the 50s.
Yeah.
They did.
Yeah.
That's Van
I
Johnson.
think I remember,
Van
but I
Johnson.
wanted to be sure.
Town team baseball was a
Another
really
thing
big
is
deal.
that I would not lie.
I'm going to agree with you. I think we have Tim. Tim.
In your photo of the Junction City baseball team, the fellow to the left of Affy actually looks like Ike. Do you know who he is?
I don't, it's No, not off the top of my head. It was published in the Junction City newspaper, which is available through newspapers.com now, so I'd have to look and see who it was. Because some people even make comments about that, like, well, he's kind of bald-headed like Ike. It's like, Ike wasn't bald-headed back then. He still had his hair. Gonna make Tim walk.
My question is that you said that Ike also in his career was a rodeo, actually said he was a cowboy.
Cowboy.
Yeah. Now, was he a rodeo cowboy or was he just?
That I don't know, but he did work on farms at the time, and so it may have been just a way of him expressing working for somebody because a lot of farms back then were more a mix, as opposed to now you just go out and you plant a bunch of wheat or you plant a bunch of whatever, but back then it was more a mixed kind of agriculture, so he may have had to wrestle some cattle. He got kicked, there's a story, I put it in there, he wrote a letter to his son, or grandson, in which he explained how he became a center fielder. And that's when he was younger, before he was playing for the high school team. A cow kicked him in the shoulder. He used to be a pitcher and a catcher when he was young, but a cow kicked him in the shoulder and he just couldn't throw that hard for that long anymore. And so he switched to center field where he didn't have to throw as much.
Well, that was unfortunate.
Yeah, so maybe that was the cowboy part. Anyone else?
What was the nature of his injury to his knee? How did that happen, and what was the nature of it, you know?
Yeah, it was during a football game. I don't know the medical terms for what it was, but it pretty much blew out his knee. He injured it again doing cavalry maneuvers, where you had to hop off the horse and then bounce over it, and his knee did not respond well to that. He spent quite a bit of time in the infirmary after that, and so that kind of ended his ability to play sports. He tried out again the next year, but it wasn't going to happen.
I was just interested in if you had a guess on how many hours you've spent researching this.
More than my boss knows. I don't ever keep track of it, but you get absorbed in this, and it's the same way when I do biology research too. I start reading things, and I'm going, oh, I gotta eat something. It's lunchtime or whatever. Well, I'll wrap this one thing up, and then the next time I look at the clock, it's like 3 hours later. Yeah. And so, yeah, I don't know, a fair amount, but it doesn't seem like work.
Right.
Because you don't learn something all the time, but every once in a while, maybe once a day, you hit that one fact, and you're going, yes, this is why I'm doing this.
Do you know if Ike was full-time at the creamery? Do we have a count of that?
Yes, and full-time meant something different back then too, right? It's not the 40-hour week, it was 6-day-a-week kind of a situation. And so, yeah. And we do know there were some others that gave interviews that are on file here, to where Ike would sometimes have to be gone for something, and he would get somebody to cover for him. Because part of it was just routine work. I mean, it wasn't that you had to be really specialized in your training, and so occasionally he would get somebody to cover for him and presumably pay him back. His brother never paid him back for the money he sent him to go to Michigan, and his excuse was, I didn't ask for it. So you can cheat a little bit on your paybacks, I guess. Oh, wait here.
Can you just summarize what is the controversy?
Today, if he had played professional baseball, and then he went to play for any kind of a sporting team at a university that was part of the NCAA, probably other groups too, but certainly for the NCAA, he would not be allowed to. And so, if he lied and said I didn't do it, that would be a violation of NCAA rules, and it would get the team in some serious trouble as well. And so that's the controversy. Was Ike lying so he could play football at college? And at the time, it was actually fairly common because you saw some of the NCAA schools did not allow you to play summer baseball. And so what they would do routinely, they would lie and play under a different name with the minor league club or whoever it was they were getting paid by. They would put a different name on that. And most of the time, people knew. If they became anything in baseball, people knew that they had lied back when they were in. The pros didn't care. It was the colleges that would care. but it could get the school in some serious trouble with those sorts of things. And at West Point, you know, the claim everybody makes is that, well, then, you know, if he lied at West Point, he could have been kicked out. Then who's the general in Europe and those kind of things. So, I mean, not just would West Point have to give up the victories they had that year, who knows, maybe we would have given up our victory in Europe or something too if he lied and had been a victory.
And also you said he hurt his leg and his arm, but he was able to play football in college.
Yeah, and well, the injury came playing football in college, so he was playing until he got injured. And so the baseball injury, he was several years younger, I can't remember the year now, but like 8 or 9 or something. So he told his grandson he didn't throw a ball for like a year or more before he could just, you know, medicine wasn't nearly what it is now. And so he had to quit playing baseball altogether for a while, just couldn't even throw the ball. But he finally got himself back up to it. He was trying to encourage his grandson to keep after something he was doing. Be persistent.
But in college, then he had to quit.
And then in college he had to quit because of that injury, yeah. He could still attend his classes at West Point and such, but he couldn't play football. He tried, but he couldn't. He just couldn't. The leg was too weak.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Say, Mark, I missed part of your introduction by
Okay.
name, but did you explain why you have this love for baseball? And did you play baseball yourself, or what did you?
No, so he wasn't very good as a center fielder. I was worse. I have no depth perception, so it just wasn't ever going to work out. But grew up around Kansas City, in Olathe, actually. My dad was a high school teacher, taught history. But we'd go to Kansas City A's games when they had real doubleheaders, so you could get 2 for the price of 1. Because, you know, when your dad's a teacher, you don't get to go to baseball, a lot of games. But my brother and I would go to games with him occasionally, watch the Kansas City A's. So I'm used to teams that lose in Kansas City. But yeah, we just, you know, backyard kind of baseball. My neighborhood was full of kids. We just pick up teams and play. It was like the movie Sandlot kind of thing.
Is that the same team that's actually the Oakland A's?
Yep. Yeah, as soon as they left, they got good.
So were you one of those guys that knows baseball stats and so forth?
Oh, no, I leave that to Bill James.
My question is, while I played baseball, was any of his games that he played in, or while he was active playing baseball, was any of them put on film? Or?
No, huh? Yeah, it was all been like 1908, 1909 kind of era, maybe 1910. So yeah, I say we were lucky to have lights for that one game, and they were horrible lights for that night game. But yeah, that film would be, boy, yeah, that would probably be playing on a loop right now.
Well, I'll just add one thing to what Mark's been saying. Every year around D-Day, we get inquiries from the press, and they all want to extrapolate that he lied again to West Point, therefore he shouldn't have been the Supreme Commander, and therefore we would have lost the war.
And as I mentioned, I got a call. I think somebody had contacted the library first, and they kind of said, "Here, read this." And so, but then he called me and followed up. I mean, he did what a reporter's supposed to do. He called me and followed up and said, "I want to ask some questions about this." This was the Washington Post, a sports writer. And so we talked about it because they were going to do a story about this, and it didn't happen. So I think that's the stuff that I was showing on those web pages, that's kind of like there forever. I mean, it's not etched in stone, but it's electrons or something. It doesn't go away. But I think that's maybe, you know, I was kind of, at first I was kind of hoping that he would write a story and say, this is nothing. But I think it's almost just as good that there just isn't a story. Because eventually that means everybody's kind of going, okay, we don't have a reason to say this anymore, so we're just not going to say it. So I don't know if there will be a newspaper story that says, it's all a hoax. We're not going to get into that part. But I mean, it's just, you know, we're just not going to do that anymore. So I guess that means it's successful.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
When did this get started, the controversy?
1945.
1945?
Immediately. Yeah, as soon as that first story went out, they never stopped asking him questions about it. Until the day he died, I think.
Anybody else? Oh, and please, if you get a chance, and if you would appreciate you filling out the surveys. But if there is nothing else, I just want to thank Mark again